His blood and power were the dual obsessions that characterized the reign of Henry VIII. As his bloated body decayed from within during the final winter days of 1547, England's most infamous king confronted his mortality with the same ruthless calculation that had led him to execute two wives and numerous adversaries. "The lion is dying," murmured courtiers behind closed doors, yet his claws remained sharp until the very end. The descent into this grotesque conclusion began decades earlier, with a handsome, athletic prince celebrated throughout Europe for his vigor and charm. How did this Renaissance golden boy evolve into the monstrous tyrant gasping for breath in the candlelit chambers of Whitehall Palace? The answer lies not solely in his notorious marriages, but also in a series of medical disasters that would distort both his body and mind beyond recognition. By January 1547, Henry was scarcely recognizable as the man who had once jousted with the finest knights in Christendom. His body had become a battleground of afflictions, with his legs plagued by suppurating ulcers that emitted a stench so repulsive that courtiers struggled to suppress their nausea in his presence. The king now required mechanical devices to maneuver his immense bulk, which some accounts suggest had ballooned to nearly 400 pounds. His once handsome visage had become distorted and swollen, with eyes sunken deep into flesh that had taken on a sickly yellow tint. The royal physicians had depleted their limited supply of remedies. Bloodletting, herbal mixtures, and prayers all proved ineffective against the array of ailments ravaging their sovereign. Most contemporary historians believe Henry suffered from type 2 diabetes, gout, and possibly osteomyelitis, a painful bone infection that would account for the chronic suffering in his legs. The king's mental decline was increasingly concerning. His once legendary temper had devolved into episodes of explosive rage, punctuated by bouts of confused lethargy. Nevertheless, as death loomed closer, the issue of succession dominated the royal court. The king's third wife, Jane Seymour, had at last given him a male heir, the frail 9-year-old Edward. However, powerful factions were already maneuvering to gain control over the boy following Henry's demise. The conservative Catholic faction, led by the Duke of Norfolk, was in competition with the reformist Protestants under Edward Seymour, the young prince's uncle. Henry, ever paranoid, was acutely aware of these schemes, signing execution orders even as he struggled to grip a pen. The king's rapidly deteriorating health was one of the realm's best-kept secrets. Official royal proclamations continued to portray Henry as robust and healthy, while the truth painted a starkly different picture. Those allowed into the royal sick room were met with a grim sight: the vast royal bed draped in dark fabrics, the sickly sweet odor of decay barely concealed by burning incense, and at the center, the enormous figure of a man who had once epitomized the vigor of England itself. Palace staff murmured about hearing the king's screams reverberate through the stone corridors of Whitehall. Henry's leg ulcers inflicted such unbearable pain that even the slightest movement could provoke paroxysms of agony. His physicians resorted to poultices made from everything ranging from boiled onions to powdered human skull, desperate remedies that only exacerbated his suffering. More effective was the generous use of opium, which numbed the king's pain but further clouded his already failing mind. The psychological anguish matched the physical torment. Henry had once been the most feared man in England, his word a matter of life or death for any subject. Now he found himself powerless against the treachery of his own kin. Court records reveal increasingly erratic behavior, with episodes of near delirium during which he would speak of the spirits of executed adversaries or call out for long-deceased wives. During clearer moments, the king obsessively examined his will, intent on controlling the future of his dynasty even after death. Contemporaries expressed alarm at how the king fluctuated between religious beliefs in these final days. After breaking from Rome to position himself as the leader of the Church of England, Henry now appeared to be plagued by spiritual uncertainties. He would request Catholic ceremonies one day, only to reaffirm Protestant doctrines the next. His personal chaplain documented how the king would awaken in fright from nightmares, asserting that he had seen the faces of Thomas More, Anne Boleyn, and other victims of his reign standing at the foot of his bed in silent condemnation. The king's imminent death created a perilous power vacuum that his courtiers hurried to fill. The Privy Council splintered into rival factions, each maneuvering to secure favorable positions in the forthcoming regency. Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk, who had navigated decades of court intrigue, now found himself outmaneuvered by the Protestant faction. In a final act of Henry's persistent ruthlessness, Norfolk was condemned to death for treason in the dying king's name, although he would ultimately survive when Henry passed away, before the execution could be executed. January 27, 1547, marked the onset of Henry's final decline. Witnesses indicated that the king suffered a seizure of such intensity that attendants were required to restrain him to avert injury. Once the episode subsided, Henry found it difficult to articulate, with his right side exhibiting partial paralysis, a clear indication of what contemporary medicine would classify as a significant stroke. The court physicians, acutely aware that their failure to save the king could lead to their own disgrace or execution, labored desperately to revive their patient, applying heated irons to his skin and administering bitter medicinal mixtures down his throat. Throughout this crisis, access to the royal bedchamber was stringently regulated by Henry's most trusted advisor, Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury. This confidentiality served a practical function beyond mere decorum. News of the king's impending death could incite premature power struggles or even foreign invasion. Cranmer ensured that only the most necessary attendants were allowed entry, each sworn to complete silence regarding the monarch's state. Even Queen Catherine Parr, Henry's sixth and surviving spouse, was kept at a distance during certain critical moments. The king oscillated between consciousness and unconsciousness as January transitioned into February. During fleeting moments of clarity, Henry reportedly conveyed escalating fear concerning his impending judgment before God. The man who had executed 2 wives, numerous nobles, and thousands of commoners now confronted his own mortality with mounting trepidation. According to the diary of one attendant, the king was heard murmuring prayers and pleading for forgiveness in his sleep, a stark contrast to the unyielding autocrat who had transformed England's religious landscape through sheer force of will. Court documents disclose the remarkable efforts made to maintain Henry's remaining dignity during these final days. As bodily functions deteriorated, teams of servants worked in shifts to handle the increasingly unpleasant tasks of cleaning and moving the substantial royal body. The odor became so overpowering that scented handkerchiefs turned into necessary items for anyone entering the royal chamber, and windows would be thrown open despite the winter chill whenever the king lost consciousness. By February 27, even the intricate facade that the king might recover could no longer be upheld within court circles. Archbishop Cranmer was urgently summoned to the royal bedside as Henry's breathing grew increasingly labored. Contemporary records depict how the king, unable to articulate, was prompted to squeeze Cranmer's hand if he placed his trust in Christ rather than in the religious rituals he had once esteemed. Henry allegedly squeezed with his remaining strength before descending into his final coma, a touching detail frequently referenced by Protestant historians as proof of a deathbed conversion. The king passed away before dawn on January 28, 1547. Even in death, Henry's immense physical presence overshadowed the royal chamber, his body a grotesque testament to excess and suffering. The official cause was simply noted as natural decay, although modern medical evaluations indicate a fatal mix of heart failure, sepsis from infected wounds, and complications likely stemming from type 2 diabetes. More astonishing than the death itself was the remarkable conspiracy of silence that ensued as the Privy Council concealed the news for 3 full days while consolidating power around young Edward VI. This delay was pivotal in ensuring a seamless transition of power. While Henry's body lay cooling in his chamber, Edward Seymour, Earl of Oxford, and uncle to the new king, acted with ruthless efficiency to secure control. Secret meetings were convened, key fortresses were fortified, and potential rivals were neutralized before the public announcement of Henry's death on January 31st. When the bells of London finally tolled to signify the monarch's passing, Edward Seymour had already been appointed Lord Protector and Duke of Somerset, effectively governing England in his nephew's name. The disposal of Henry's remains posed distinct challenges that illuminated much about both Tudor funeral customs and the king's physical state at the time of his death. Court records indicate that the royal body began to decompose at an alarming rate, likely due to the severe infections that were already present. Embalmers worked diligently to prepare the body, extracting internal organs and filling the cavities with aromatic herbs and preservatives. Even these specialists were reportedly taken aback by the condition of Henry's internal organs, especially his diseased liver and swollen heart. Henry's coffin required special construction to accommodate his considerable size, reportedly measuring nearly twice the width of a standard noble's casket. The weight necessitated a reinforced bier and additional pallbearers for transport. During the lying-in state at Whitehall, witnesses noted that the lead-lined coffin actually split under the pressure from gases accumulating within the decomposing body, causing fluids to leak onto the chapel floor. This gruesome detail was quickly concealed, but reports suggest that dogs licked at the seepage, creating a grotesque final indignity for a king who was fixated on majesty. The funeral procession to Windsor Castle on February 16th offered the Tudor regime one last chance to showcase Henry's power, even in death. Horses draped in black pulled the enormous coffin through streets filled with mourners, while effigies portrayed the king as he had looked in his prime rather than the bloated figure he had become. At St. George's Chapel in Windsor Castle, Henry was interred beside Jane Seymour, the only wife who had borne him a son and heir, and the only one who had been spared the experience of falling from royal favor by dying from childbirth complications before Henry's affections could diminish. The physical reality of Henry's decaying corpse sharply contrasted with the myth-making that was already in progress regarding his reign. Court painters, such as Hans Holbein, had created the lasting image of Henry as the broad-shouldered representation of masculine strength, with legs firmly planted and hands on hips, glaring defiantly at the observer. This meticulously crafted propaganda bore little resemblance to the disease-ravaged body now entombed beneath Windsor's stone floor. Nevertheless, it would become the definitive portrayal of Henry VIII in the collective imagination for centuries to follow. Henry's will unveiled his ultimate attempts to influence the future from beyond the grave. The 30-page document carefully outlined the line of succession, beginning with Edward, followed by Mary, the daughter of his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, and concluding with Elizabeth, the daughter of Anne Boleyn. This explicit line of succession, although briefly interrupted by the 9-day reign of Lady Jane Grey, would ultimately be adhered to as Henry had intended. The king's posthumous influence over England would persist through all three of his children, each of whom would reign as monarchs until the dynasty ultimately concluded with the death of Elizabeth I in 1603. More immediately relevant were the power structures Henry established for Edward's minority. The king formed a regency council of 16 men designed to govern collectively until Edward reached the age of 18. This balanced strategy reflected Henry's skepticism towards any single nobleman gaining excessive influence over his son. However, his careful arrangements were swiftly undermined as Edward Seymour outmaneuvered his fellow counselors to be appointed Lord Protector within days of Henry's passing. The rapidity with which Henry's intentions were thwarted illustrated the limitations of a king's authority once death removed his formidable presence. The medical legacy of Henry's final days continues to intrigue both historians and medical professionals alike. His symptoms have been retrospectively identified as indicative of a range of conditions, from syphilis to scurvy. However, the most persuasive evidence points to type 2 diabetes complicated by chronic osteomyelitis. The medical records of the king illustrate increasingly desperate treatments, including the application of live pigeons that were cut in half and placed on his festering wounds, as well as experimental mixtures of gold and ground precious stones. These costly yet ineffective remedies highlight both the limitations of Tudor medicine and the extraordinary measures taken for a patient of Henry's stature. Perhaps the most touching discoveries were the personal items found in the king's chambers following his death. Among the anticipated symbols of royal authority, dual daggers, official seals, and diplomatic correspondence, servants uncovered a small locked chest containing more personal belongings. A miniature portrait of Jane Seymour, a lock of hair believed to belong to his mother, Elizabeth of York, and a child's handwritten prayer book that may have belonged to Elizabeth prior to her mother's execution. These humanizing elements provide a glimpse into the individual behind the fearsome reputation, suggesting that even as his physical and mental health declined, Henry retained some connection to familial ties and personal emotions. The king's passing prompted immediate political shifts that would influence England's future for many years. Conservative Catholic factions that had held sway during Henry's last years found themselves suddenly marginalized as Edward Seymour established a distinctly Protestant regency. Archbishop Cranmer, who had administered the last rites to the dying king, now expedited the religious reforms that Henry had approached with more caution. The first English Book of Common Prayer was published merely 2 years after Henry's death, propelling England further toward Protestant doctrine than the king himself had ever envisioned. Henry's intricate religious stance, having severed ties with Rome while still adhering to numerous Catholic traditions, resulted in an ambiguous legacy that permitted both Protestant and Catholic groups to claim him as their own. Protestant reformers highlighted his rejection of papal authority, whereas Catholics pointed to his defense of transubstantiation and his opposition to Lutheran theology. This theological ambiguity would incite religious conflicts throughout the reigns of all three of his offspring, as England oscillated between radical Protestantism under Edward, Catholic restoration under Mary, and ultimately the middle path established by Elizabeth. The king's demise also signified a pivotal moment in Tudor propaganda. Having shaped the image of Henry as England's protector against foreign threats and papal oppression, royal publicists now confronted the challenge of transferring this authority to a 9-year-old boy. Portraits of young Edward VI intentionally mirrored his father's iconic stance, portraying the child with the same wide-legged posture and defiant expression that had defined Henry's most renowned portraits. Court ceremonies underscored continuity, with courtiers obliged to bow to Edward's vacant throne with the same reverence they had shown his father. Beyond the political realm, Henry's death resonated throughout daily life across England. For nearly 4 decades, he had embodied royal authority, his personality and whims directly influencing governance down to the local level. His passing created a psychological void as much as a political one. Parish records from early 1547 indicate widespread anxiety about the future, with heightened reports of prophetic dreams, unusual celestial omens, and even purported ghost sightings. For a populace steeped in religious symbolism, the death of such a dominant king inevitably bore apocalyptic implications. International responses to Henry's death unveiled the intricate position England now held on the European stage. The French ambassador conveyed that King Francis XIII genuinely grieved for his beloved brother from England, despite their ongoing disputes. Emperor Charles V, the nephew of Catherine of Aragon, took a more pragmatic view of the strategic consequences, pondering whether England, under a child king, might be susceptible to invasion or forming alliances. Pope Paul III, who had excommunicated Henry a decade prior, allegedly offered a mass for the king's soul, a diplomatic act that recognized Henry's importance while reaffirming the Catholic Church's claim over his spiritual fate. The location of Henry's death, his private quarters in Whitehall Palace, quickly became imbued with historical significance. Courtiers expressed hesitation to enter the rooms where the king had endured his final sufferings, with tales of strange noises and inexplicable cold spots intensifying superstitious anxieties. Young Edward VI reportedly declined to sleep in his father's bed, demanding that new chambers be prepared for him. This psychological aftermath illustrates the profound impact of Henry's death on those who had observed his decline, many of whom had dedicated their lives to anticipating and fulfilling his unpredictable demands. Henry's medical case stands as one of history's most thoroughly documented royal deaths, offering valuable insights into Tudor medical practices. His physicians maintained meticulous records of the treatments administered during his last months, which survived as evidence that every possible effort had been made to save the king. These records unveil a methodology that merged ancient Galenic medicine with emerging Renaissance techniques, including hot cupping to extract bad humors, herbal remedies derived from classical texts, and even early forms of hydrotherapy. The inability of these methods to provide relief highlights the challenges encountered by even the most skilled medical practitioners of that time. The king's fixation on his posthumous reputation led him to provide detailed directives for his tomb, a colossal edifice intended to overshadow all other royal burial places in England. Henry commissioned intricate designs that included 40 life-size bronze figures and a grand central structure crowned with an equestrian statue of himself. This extravagant scheme mirrored both his self-importance and his apprehension regarding how future generations would perceive him. Ironically, the extensive project remained incomplete due to financial limitations, and the intended bronze figures were ultimately melted down during the English Civil War, a turn of events that would have enraged the image-conscious monarch. In the immediate aftermath of Henry's passing, there was a frantic effort to either secure or dissociate from his legacy. Courtiers who had fallen out of favor during his last years re-emerged from obscurity, while those who had benefited from his patronage rushed to forge new protective alliances. Archives held poignant letters from royal servants who suddenly found themselves without roles after decades of catering to the king's personal demands. For many, adapting proved to be an insurmountable challenge. The abilities needed to manage Henry's unpredictable temperament had little relevance in the more subdued court of Edward VI. Some former favorites took their own lives in the months following the king's death, unable to cope with the swift changes in power dynamics. Perhaps most importantly, Henry's death signified the onset of a significant shift in English governance, moving from the rule of an absolute monarch whose personal desires dictated policy to more collaborative methods of power sharing between the crown and the nobility. Edward Seymour, serving as Lord Protector, lacked Henry's formidable personal authority and depended more on the approval of the council. This transition, although temporarily reversed during Mary's reign, set precedents for the limitation of royal power that would further evolve under Elizabeth and ultimately contribute to England's distinctive constitutional development. Henry's demise, paradoxically, undermined the very institution of absolute monarchy that he had dedicated his life to fortifying. The king's terminal illness became a focal point of intense medical reflection, with each generation of physicians reinterpreting his symptoms in light of contemporary medical knowledge. Victorian physicians, influenced by moral views on illness, highlighted syphilis as a probable cause, interpreting Henry's condition as divine punishment for his sexual indulgences. In the early 20th century, specialists shifted their focus towards metabolic disorders, proposing gout and diabetes as the main offenders. Modern medical historians have suggested more intricate diagnoses, including McLeod syndrome, a rare genetic disorder that could account for both his physical decline and psychological alterations, as well as chronic traumatic encephalopathy resulting from numerous jousting injuries sustained in his youth. The disposal of Henry's personal belongings offers a revealing insight into Tudor perspectives on death and remembrance. Court inventories illustrate how items that had been in contact with the king during his final days were treated with special reverence, with some preserved as quasi-relics despite the official Protestant disavowal of such customs. His last set of nightclothes, marked by bodily fluids, was ceremonially incinerated under Cranmer's oversight, an act that merged practical sanitation with symbolic meaning. More valuable possessions, such as his extensive collection of astronomical instruments and maps, were meticulously catalogued before being allocated according to his will or kept for Edward's education. Henry's passing placed his surviving wives and children in vulnerable situations, necessitating careful navigation of court politics. Catherine Parr, his widow, publicly maintained a dignified mourning while privately acting with remarkable swiftness to marry her true love, Thomas Seymour, a union she had postponed during Henry's lifetime. 9-year-old Edward, who was now king in title, yet significantly influenced by his Seymour uncles, documented his father's passing with unsettling detachment in his journal. The emperor's ambassador was instructed to return home on January 4th, following the death of the king, my father, whose soul may God pardon. This formal and emotionless entry indicates the limited personal bond between father and son. Meanwhile, Henry's daughters encountered their own difficulties in the new regime. Mary, at the age of 31, remained a devoted Catholic, increasingly estranged by Edward's Protestant reforms. Elizabeth, merely 13, had to maneuver through court life with remarkable caution, her position made precarious by her mother's execution and the ongoing doubts regarding her legitimacy. Both princesses would ultimately ascend to the throne that Henry had assured them, but the journey would be perilous. Mary narrowly escaped execution during Wyatt's rebellion, while Elizabeth endured imprisonment in the Tower during her sister's reign. The narratives of Henry's final moments illustrate the profound isolation experienced by even the most powerful monarch at the time of death. Despite being surrounded by physicians, attendants, and courtiers, contemporary accounts suggest that Henry confronted his demise in fundamental solitude, separated from others by both his royal status and the deeply personal nature of death itself. Archbishop Cranmer, seeking to provide spiritual solace, reportedly received little reaction beyond that final hand squeeze. The king, who had commanded absolute obedience throughout his realm, ultimately found himself embarking on his final journey alone, serving as a poignant reminder of mortality's great leveling force. The year following Henry's death demonstrated how thoroughly his character had influenced English governance. Administrative records indicate a backlog of decisions that awaited his personal attention, many of which pertained to matters that subordinates could have resolved, yet were escalated to royal decision due to a culture of profound deference. During Edward's regency, governmental processes were necessarily restructured to operate without the king's direct involvement. This transition, although initially tumultuous, ultimately fortified institutional governance, fostering bureaucratic systems capable of functioning independently of the monarch's personal oversight. Henry's grand funeral procession marked his final appearance in England's public sphere of power. Contemporary accounts depict horses adorned in black velvet, heralds carrying ceremonial weapons, and a life-size wax effigy of the king in full regalia positioned atop his coffin. The artificial figure, serving as a substitute for the decaying natural body, was concealed beneath. This procession journeyed from London to Windsor over several days, enabling thousands of subjects to witness this final display of Tudor grandeur. The meticulous choreography mirrored profound anxiety regarding political transition, employing ritual to convey the message that, while the king may perish, the monarchy persists. Court physicians, who had been unable to save the king, faced uncertain destinies in the aftermath. Medical records indicate that some individuals swiftly secured positions with other noble families, while others encountered professional ostracism due to their connection with Henry's unsuccessful treatment. Dr. Thomas Wendy, who had the fortitude to inform Henry of his impending demise when others refrained from doing so, leveraged this act of bravery into ongoing royal service under Edward VI. The king's apothecaries were subjected to particular scrutiny, with inventories of medicines provided during Henry's final illness being examined for potential negligence or, even more concerning, intentional hastening of death. The scientific analysis of Henry's remains, carried out during vault renovations in the 1800s, yielded intriguing insights into his physical state at the time of death. Workers reported the discovery of an enormous skeleton, to be continued